Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Daisy Lemus. I am a professor of communication studies, and I'm a co-PI of a USDA grant, IRA grant, that Chris Kachikian and I worked with the Tataviam Band of Mission Indians to be awarded a grant on tree planting. And so I saw some of the names of the RSVPs are also awardees of the IRA grant. So we have a very similar interest, and so we're really happy to welcome our colleagues and also our friends from all of these other grants related to the IRA grant. I see there's some students here, there are faculty, there are some CSUN staff as well, some people from the city, people from city plants, people from the county, people from the USDA. So we're really, really happy that we have a good mix in our audience because the topic is so relevant to all of us. And so the title of this presentation is Barriers to Tree Plantings, but really this is a conversation with our guest, Dr. Hamil Pearsall. She is a faculty member at Temple University. She's an urban geographer, and her expertise is in environmental and social justice as it relates to urban processes and change. And recently, she published a paper titled Barriers to Resident Participation in Tree Planting Initiatives Across a Metropolitan Area. And it was co-authored with some colleagues, and it's just sort of a larger picture of a lot of the work that she's been doing. And so when we saw her recent publication, we're really excited because this is exactly what we want to learn about as we engage in our own communities in tree planting initiatives and also just sustainability in general. So we're really pleased and happy that she agreed to present for us, and we'll get to hear a little bit about what she researched and the findings, and then we'll have a lot of time for questions, and the Q&A portion of it will happen a little bit later. But I want to make sure that you know that you can, when we get to that part, you can unmute and ask your question, or you can also type it in the chat and we'll be monitoring it. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Hamil Pearsall. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Lemus and Dr. Kachikian, for inviting me to speak with you. I really appreciate you all coming today on a Monday morning. That's real dedication. And I'm excited to share this project with you. So I'll provide a little bit of background to how this project came about. I had been working with a greening organization in the city of Philadelphia, which is where I've been working for the last 12 years. And this organization does various things, but one of the things that they do is support communities with tree planting initiatives. And the founder of the program, the Tree Tenders program, is Mindy Moslin, who's one of the names listed on the title here. And she created this program back in the 90s, and she has been really influential in creating all these community-based tree planting programs. But she was talking to me and she said, you know, we've had a lot of success in some neighborhoods, but we've noticed in other neighborhoods, we've had like less success. It's been challenging to plant trees and to work with community members on tree planting projects. Do you think you could help us understand the reasons why we're having such challenges? So I had my new PhD student at the time, whose name is here, Liz Reedman. She has since graduated and moved on to a postdoc at UCLA. But at this moment, it was back in 2020, kind of the peak of the pandemic, when she did this initial project to understand barriers to tree planting initiatives in North Philadelphia. And the results were really insightful. And we decided to scale up the project and ask this question more broadly across both the city of Philadelphia as well as the surrounding suburbs. So I worked on this project. It was truly transdisciplinary. So in addition to working with researchers from Temple and from the Toronto Metropolitan University, we worked with Laura Roman, who's a Forest Service research ecologist. And then we also worked with practitioners from this greening organization called the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. And it was really wonderful to have this project come about really rooted in need rather than having me imagine these problems that I could solve. So it was very motivating to do this work. And it's certainly, these questions that we were asking certainly are not limited to the city of Philadelphia. So cities across the country have recognized that they have inequitable canopy cover. And this creates a problem because we know that neighborhoods with low canopy cover tend to be hotter and they don't receive all the benefits of trees that well-canopied neighborhoods do. So despite the fact that cities have recognized the fact that they have this inequitable canopy cover, there hasn't been as much success as we would have liked in terms of addressing those inequities. So even when organizations intentionally try to plant in these low canopy neighborhoods, it hasn't always worked. And these inequities persist. We continue to have neighborhoods with really low canopy cover. So our project was designed to understand barriers to tree planting initiatives in different types of neighborhoods. And because there's been kind of a growing recognition that this is an issue in many different urban neighborhoods, there's been some research. And this previous research has pointed to concerns such as just limited capacity. Community organizations do so much work across so many different sectors. Adding tree planting to that can really stretch them. Other research has pointed to resident concerns over accepting free trees because it's a responsibility. Trees live for a long time, multiple decades. So, what does that mean for residents who are suddenly tasked with caring for them? Other studies have pointed towards the fact that they just don't see space to plant trees in their neighborhood. There's sidewalks, there's roads, they don't have yards. Where do you put trees? A number of additional studies have pointed to the fact that while we talk about trees as being, good, some people find that they have disservices associated with them. So they drop leaves once a year. They require water. Some people have allergies. So many residents are very aware of these tree disservices. And then there's been other research done in Detroit and also LA that has looked at kind of the tense relationships between city government and residents around the history of tree planting, where residents feel like the city hasn't done their part in terms of maintaining trees and they've caused problems. So our study wanted to really focus on the experience of residents in tree planting initiatives, as well as the experience of community leaders who are dedicating their time towards trying to add more trees in neighborhoods. And we wanted to do some comparative research to understand geographic variation in these barriers across the metropolitan area. So our main questions were really focused on the metropolitan area of Philadelphia. And we wanted to understand how these barriers varied. So we looked at the types of barriers to participation in tree planting initiatives, community leaders experienced, residents experienced. We wanted to know which barriers were most common, which ones were very context specific. And we also wanted to look at how these barriers differed across urban and suburban, as well as high and low canopy neighborhoods. For our research design, we did a few different things. We started off by selecting neighborhoods with active tree planting initiatives, and we conducted 11 interviews with these community leaders. We then went out and stood in public spaces and conducted intercept surveys with residents. We had conducted a total of 93, with 47 from city neighborhoods, 46 from suburban neighborhoods, across 8 different communities in total. These intercept surveys were very brief. They were maybe 5-minute interactions. They were like a total nightmare for an introvert, but I did it. I was very proud that I got it done. And then from those people that we did the intercept surveys with, we conducted more in-depth focus groups for residents who opted in. And this, just if you're interested in qualitative research, this was really interesting because the conversations were really nuanced, reflected people's lived experience with trees. But they were definitely a self-selecting crowd. So pretty much everybody who wanted to participate in a focus group about trees absolutely loved trees. I was really hoping to get a different perspective, but in the end, it was a very enthusiastic audience. All of these different modes of communications ask people about their perceptions of their local canopy cover and ask about what allowed them to plant trees and what challenges they experienced in planting trees. And because we talked to people across so many different neighborhoods, we did, with the exception of the focus groups, hear about a lot of different perspectives. And while I'm not able to identify the different communities by name because of IRB confidentiality, you can see here some of the diversity and the different demographics of the 8 neighborhoods. We had 4 in the city of Philadelphia. We had 4 in surrounding suburbs. the percentage of canopy cover ranged from 3% in one city neighborhood up to 54% in another city neighborhood. And you can see, one neighborhood was had very high poverty, very low poverty. We had a very racially and ethnically diverse set of neighborhoods. We really wanted to understand different perspectives from people living in different neighborhoods. So after we talked to all the people on the sidewalks, in the public spaces, in the focus groups, did the interviews with community leaders, we went through and coded all of this data based on all the different barriers that people mentioned. And here's the list of barriers that we learned about through the interactions with residents. So people mentioned physical barriers, maintenance barriers, knowledge barriers, land use and aesthetic preferences, institutional barriers, and then a handful of people mentioned environmental and ecological condition barriers. So I'm going to go through each of these barriers and illustrate them a little bit more. And then I'll move in and talk about what community leaders had to say in addition to this. And it's really interesting to compare the resident and community leader perspectives. So physical barriers, this was like the number one barrier that people mentioned. They simply said, there's not enough plantable space to add trees to my neighborhood. And I lived in Philadelphia for 9 years, and I agree, there isn't a lot of space in dense urban neighborhoods to add trees. The sidewalks are narrow. Many places don't have a yard at all in the front. And if they have a backyard, the idea of planting a tree is like, well, do you want a backyard or do you want a tree? What was really interesting about this is that even in suburban neighborhoods with much lower density, physical barriers was still the number one barrier people mentioned. They said, well, I have a yard, but there's a power line that runs through it, or, I'm worried about my housing foundation. So despite the fact that I, in my mind, imagine density to be the primary factor that would condition somebody's response as physical barrier to be a top barrier, really it was very similar across all different types of neighborhoods that people saw physical barriers as a real issue for planting trees. One of the other top barriers that people mentioned was maintenance. So oftentimes with tree planting programs, an organization will say, we're going to offer you a free tree. We'll even plant the tree for you. And residents often would raise concerns saying, well, we appreciate the free tree. We're really happy that you'll help us plant it. But trees grow and they need to be maintained over time. And so a number of people raised all sorts of issues about maintaining trees over time. Some of them had to do with watering. Is this going to raise my water bill? Other ones had to do with pruning. Am I going to have to hire somebody to prune my tree? I don't know how to prune. I wouldn't feel comfortable doing it. And so this idea of the expense of maintenance came up over and over again. And some of it was direct experience. I had a tree once, the roots pushed up my sidewalk. It was very expensive for us to replace it because in the city of Philadelphia, it's property owners who are responsible for repairing sidewalks. And then other people remembered, oh, I had to care for this tree over 30 to 40 years, and it really cost me a lot of money. So even if you got a tree for free, it didn't mean that it was free for the life cycle of the tree. The other issue that came up in all different neighborhoods time and time again was that trees can be a nuisance. They drop leaves. And a lot of people said, I don't like to rake the leaves. Even if it only happens once a year, I'd rather do something else with my time. Other people noticed that fruit would drop on the ground. It would be really messy. There are a lot of ginkgo trees in Philadelphia that drop fruit and they are slippery on the sidewalk and they are really gross to clean up and people didn't want to do it. The other thing that this actually went both ways. Some people said they loved wildlife that lived in trees, but other people said, well, I think the type of wildlife that trees attract is a nuisance because they make a mess in my yard or they're going to dig a hole in my roof. So really this idea of trees as a nuisance came up time and time again. Another issue that people raised with respect to maintenance was concerns over falling trees and falling limbs damaging their property. And several people shared these stories. So I have two in quotes here because I thought they were really striking. So this one person said, when I first moved out there, one of the bigger trees, pretty much as big as the tree in front of my house, actually fell and crushed one of my neighbor's brand new Cadillacs. So there was this moment where there was damage, but also just that memory of it persisted. They remember that so clearly. Like there's this tree limb, it fell, it damaged my neighbor's brand new car. And then another person remembered the time when they had a down tree take out the electric wire, and they had to move out of their house for a few months to get it repaired. So these are like direct stories of people remembering this happening, but when people would share this information with their neighbors, it would really create this indirect experience that people were concerned about having happen to them. The third type of barrier we started to hear a lot about was this idea of lack of knowledge. And this was really interesting because, again, we're working in neighborhoods with very active tree planting initiatives happening. But people raised all types of concerns about things they weren't quite sure of when it came to planting trees. So one person, or a number of people, said, I'm not really sure about planting a tree. I don't know who's responsible in caring for a tree. And this type of comment tended to come up in cities where there was like a question of jurisdiction. Like, am I allowed to plant on the sidewalk? I thought that was city property, or certainly I couldn't decide that I wanted to plant a tree in a park. That wouldn't make sense. So a number of people were very confused, like, oh, like, could I plant a tree? Is that something I'm allowed to do? Shouldn't the city do that? Do I have to care for it? The second way that lack of knowledge came up was with respect to how trees grow and whether or not they'll damage their homes or sidewalks. So I remember there was one person saying, well, I'd like to plant a tree here, but it's a small space, and I'm not sure if it will push up my sidewalk. And that would really be a problem because I think they had a sibling in a wheelchair, and they were very concerned that if they planted a tree, it would make the sidewalk difficult for their sibling to pass. And this person was saying, I think other people, they share similar concerns about trees creating damage because there's a lot of people cutting down trees because they're too close to their house and they're worried that it'll fall and damage their home. And then the third way that lack of knowledge came up was with respect to caring for a tree. And I remember I was doing one of the intercept interviews in a park and talking to two people about it. And they were like, I have no idea. Like, what if the tree died on my watch? I would feel so awful. So this sense that, I haven't planted a tree before, even if you give me a tree, like, what if it doesn't work? What if I forget to water it and it dies? The sense of, I have a lot going on. I don't know if I know how to do this or have time for it. The next type of barrier that came up had to do with land use and aesthetic preferences. And this was very, very interesting. So a number of people, pretty much everybody we talked to said, I really like trees. I remember talking to one person who said, nah, I don't like trees. But most people like trees, but they liked other things in their outdoor space as well. So several people said, trees, they create shade, and that makes my flowers and vegetables, not grow as well. I really like my herb garden. One person said, I really hope to put solar panels on my roof, and I plant one of those big shade trees that would, not make that work as well. And then, and this is very well documented in the literature, overall, there's a strong preference for small stature trees. And part of that is out of fear of large trees falling and creating damage. But the other part is many small stature trees, they like the aesthetics of them. They're dogwood trees. They have pretty blossoms in the spring. And while that is still a tree, as far as organizations like shade tree commissions go, they don't provide the same types of environmental benefits as those large trees. The second way that land use and aesthetics came up was with respect to space. So in Philadelphia, there's this ongoing joke that it's all about parking. People talk about parking all the time because everybody's trying to look for a parking space. And so when I was talking to somebody about planting a tree in their back alley, they were like, oh no, you might lose a parking space. And that would create real conflict. The same question about space, this idea of trade-offs, happened in the suburbs. When we were talking to people about their yard spaces, they said, well, I do have a yard. It's not a huge yard. And if I planted a tree, it would interfere with other activities in my backyard. So, I'd like to have space to plant a lawn and have, a jungle gym and have my dog running around. So this idea that city and suburban spaces, they do have space for a tree, but it would get in the way of something else. This even came up in the context of city parks. A lot of people agree parks are great places to plant trees, but in a dense city like Philadelphia with limited park space, people said, well, you could plant trees, but that's where people play ball. Or in this small pocket park, you could plant a tree, but this is where we have the picnic table. Like, what if we didn't have space for a picnic table here? So this idea that it's like a tree or some other community space came up over and over again. The next barrier had to do with tree policies and practices, and this was incredibly interesting. And so we defined institutional barriers very broadly as any type of rule or practice from a municipal agency, utility company, or developers. One barrier that came up in all neighborhoods that we talked about were the lack of policies that limited tree removals. We had a number of people telling us stories about, trees being removed, they felt didn't need to be removed. They were kind of done without any public input. They're very frustrated by that, especially if it was on city property. Many people complained that utility companies were targeting residents for tree removals. So utility companies are tasked with ensuring that power lines aren't being knocked over by tree limbs, but many residents felt that utility companies were taking out trees that didn't need to be taken out. And then finally, a lot of people, especially in the city of Philadelphia, complained that there wasn't a good policy for replacing trees. So trees were being removed and they weren't being replaced. And that created a lot of frustration that we're overall going to experience canopy loss because replacement trees aren't being planted. And then the last barrier that residents raised had to do with the site conditions. So this is interesting. We had a spotted lanternfly outbreak, which created a lot of damage to vegetation. It's an ongoing problem today. But some people we talked to in one of the suburban communities said, I planted a tree and the spotted lanternfly ate it. So they were very frustrated. Like I went to all the work to plant this tree and now it's gone. And really more in city neighborhoods, a lot of people commented that there were very harsh conditions for trees to grow. Not impossible, they're trees in cities, but they required a lot of care, a lot of water, and that became burdensome in, say, August when it was very hot to carry water to a tree. And then lastly, some people noted that wildlife would come and eat their trees, the newly planted trees. But overall, this was a fairly minor barrier compared to the previous ones. In terms of the frequency of the barriers, I'll just kind of go over the top barriers. So I think I mentioned this before, but physical barriers was the #1 barrier mentioned across every neighborhood. 62% of residents said, there's just not enough space for me to plant a tree. City neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods, everybody felt there wasn't enough space. Just over half of residents mentioned these concerns over maintenance, the cost of maintenance, having to rake the leaves. And then the third most cited barrier was limited knowledge. And so just under half of residents mentioned that. And again, that's really surprising because we were only working in neighborhoods where there were active organizations planting trees, usually twice a year. So it's a question, why do people have so many questions about trees given that there are these organizations doing this work in their neighborhood? So in terms of the context specific barriers, what did we see? So this is very intuitive, but it tended to be in the lowest canopy neighborhoods where we heard a lot about physical barriers. And this makes the most sense. There tend to be fewer trees in very dense neighborhoods, simply because there aren't spaces for street trees, there aren't yards. In terms of the institutional barriers, we heard about this much more from city residents than suburban residents who are more inclined to plant on private property. On the other hand, suburban residents, they had more opinions about their outdoor space. So they raised these questions about land use preferences. Do I want a tree? Do I want a flower bed? Do I want a lawn? And then lack of knowledge was fairly pervasive across city and suburban resident perspectives, but with different types of questions. So a lot of city residents weren't sure if they were allowed to plant a tree, especially a street tree. And then suburban residents were really interested to know how to apply for a tree. Like where could they get a tree? So that's kind of the overview of the resident barriers. And that work we published last year, or I guess earlier this year, in the journal Urban Forestry and Urban Greening. But we also had kind of part 2 of this study, which I'll present now because it's really interesting to compare and contrast the resident and the community leader perspectives. So community leaders raised a lot of pretty much the same barriers as residents, except they also talked a lot about the barriers they face as community members leading these tree planting initiatives. So I'll go over those. The #1 barrier that people mentioned is just the challenge of keeping enough volunteers. And they said that it is hard to recruit people to stay involved over the long term. It's not as hard to recruit people to come and plant a tree when it's that day when everybody comes out to plant a tree. And so that kind of spoke to, over time, some of the burnout that they experienced in being the sole person, in their neighborhood, keeping this going. And it really was a lot of work in terms of kind of managing, knocking on doors, figuring out tree spaces, all of that. The other type of barrier that leaders raised had to do with a sense of frustration, because community leaders planting trees love planting trees. They found it deeply satisfying. They love nothing more than planting a tree, walking by it every day and being like, yes, like we did that. We got this tree in our neighborhood. But oftentimes residents said no. They were like, gosh, I just don't understand why anybody would say no to a free tree. And, you know, this was part of why our project was interesting, to understand why don't people want a tree. But the leaders felt a real sense of like frustration. It's just a challenge. I'm not getting more people to plant trees, and I don't really know why. Another issue that came up was that the city of Philadelphia has experienced budget constraints like many other cities across the country, that the city, because they weren't able to do this work, that volunteers had to step up and do it for free. And while the labor itself, volunteers didn't directly say they wanted to be there, they wanted to be doing this important work, but they felt really frustrated that the city wasn't helping more, especially like for things that involved a lot of manual labor. So couldn't the city come with a backhoe and dig out this spot instead of me standing here, with my tools doing it by hand? Or why couldn't the city drive by with their watering truck and water all these trees instead of me pushing my cart with water in August when it's so hot out to do this work? So this was interesting because I thought this would be primarily a kind of a city issue, but it wasn't. A lot of the suburban municipalities that we worked in said the same thing. Like, they don't have funding for this. If we don't do it, it's not going to get done, even though they have equipment and we feel like they should be doing it. So some of these interesting distinctions between leaders and residents were this issue of plantable space. So as I mentioned, community leaders were really passionate about planting trees. So for them, they saw limited plantable space as what I'd say is a constraint. Well, the built environment kind of shapes where we can plant trees, but you can always plant trees. Whereas residents would look around and just be like, I don't know. I don't see any space to plant a tree. We cannot plant a tree here. The second kind of distinction between the community leaders and residents had to do with this perception of trees as a nuisance or burden for residents and institutions. So many residents would say, I don't really want to rake, or I don't have to worry about my neighbors getting mad at me for not raking. Institutions would say, I don't want to have to pay extra for maintenance to have to go around the trees. I'd rather than just, mow the lawn. And leaders felt really irritated by this. Like, why can't people just get out there with their rakes? It's good physical activity. This sense of like disconnect. I don't understand the residents. And then the last kind of big distinction had to do with the education and outreach component of the work that they were doing, because leaders felt like education and outreach was like the bulk of what they were doing. They were knocking on doors, they were talking about trees, they were trying to assuage people's concerns about trees. But when we talked to residents, a lot of them said, almost 50% said they felt like they truly lacked knowledge of trees and therefore would be reluctant to accept a tree because they felt like they didn't know where they could plant it or how to care for it. The other interesting thing, which I did not anticipate and I did not think of, I should say, I actually don't have the most green thumb. I love working on urban forestry, but I'm not a gardener. But very few residents mentioned watering trees as the primary reason they wouldn't accept a tree. But community leaders felt that this was like almost the number one issue that limited plantings, because they would look around and they would see where in their community they could plant a tree and water it easily. And this truly was an issue because a lot of the spaces where they wanted to plant trees simply didn't have water nearby. And you can think about a hot summer day, a parking lot. That'd be a great place to plant a tree, provide some canopy, but there was no easy way to get water there. Or another place was on the barrier in between roads. They would love to plant trees there, but there was no way to get water there. And pretty much all the community leaders that we talked to, we did this work over the summer, we did it as they were watering, and they would push these huge bins of water on a cart around the neighborhood, in August watering. one other distinction had to do with the presence of shade trees. So overall, the city of Philadelphia has lost canopy cover. So a lot of shade tree commissions and organizations are really encouraging residents to plant shade trees. But residents don't want shade trees. They don't want all that shade, and they want to use the space for other things. And they're worried about limbs falling. So this kind of frustration. Our municipality has a shade tree commission, but that's like the one thing people don't want to have right now. And then finally, there was a lot of distinctions between the types of institutional barriers that were raised by leaders and residents. So urban residents specifically were very frustrated with how the city had failed to care for trees in the past. And they felt that trees, created property damage, they were a nuisance, or they were simply unsightly. So they had a real concern with trust with the city around trees. Suburban community leaders were very frustrated that their municipalities didn't provide more support for trees, and that there weren't specifically more policies limiting tree removal, because they felt that they dedicated a lot of time to planting trees, and then those trees were removed by utility companies or for some other reason. City leaders had a different set of frustrations. They felt because in the city of Philadelphia, they require a property owner's permission to plant. And they felt that it was very frustrating to have to go around and identify the property owner and contact them and get permission, that really limited their ability to plant trees where they were needed most. So like renters, for instance, couldn't give permission to plant a tree, or any sort of commercial entity. They had to chase down the person who would give them approval, and it took a lot of time. So all these different ways that policies were either non-existent or how they didn't support tree planting. All right, I'm getting in the home stretch here. So one other thing that came out of the research is that there were a lot of barriers that emerged across the tree life cycle. And this is really interesting because a lot of tree planting initiatives focus on the early phases. They focus on getting people to say, hey, I would like a tree. And they focus on getting the tree in the ground. So if you think about that whole life cycle, we know preparing to plant, planting a tree, absolutely critical to getting a tree in the ground. But over time, you have to continue to maintain it. In the first 3 years, you need to water it regularly. As the tree gets bigger and bigger, you need to maintain it. And then finally, at the end, you need to remove it before it creates damage. And both community leaders and residents felt that there really wasn't much support for the latter phases. There was very little support for caring for a tree, and there was no support for removing a tree, and it was very expensive. So in terms of barriers, addressing those barriers in the kind of latter phases of the life cycle of a tree would be really important. So I'll wrap up. We felt that the research really highlighted some of the similarities that residents and leaders across the metro area faced in planting trees, but there are also some important distinctions. But some common barriers had to do with that idea of limited space or perceptions of limited space. Some institutional concerns really varied from suburban or urban context and depending on the person. That issue of barriers across the life cycle. And I think overall to recognize that as city budgets are rather constrained, it's really these residents and community leaders who are the primary stewards of the local tree canopy. So addressing the barriers that they experience is critical to being able to grow your tree canopy over time and also be able to grow it in a way that's equitable. So I don't know if we can discuss this. I'd be really curious because I've just done this work on the East Coast in Philadelphia. So I would love to hear, what your experiences are and these different types of barriers and ways of overcoming them. But before we go to the Q&A, I just wanted to thank our funder, the Forest Service, and to thank this whole team that worked on this project together. It was really a joy to work on it and to feel like we're addressing a critical problem in need. So I'll wrap up there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Hamil. So as Daisy mentioned, I'm Chris Kachikian. I'm one of the PIs. I'll moderate the question. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand and I can loop you in. I don't see anything in the chat yet. So I did have a question. I'm super curious now because this is super fascinating work, and I realize how complicated it is to get someone to plant a tree and the barriers you were going through. I'm like, oh yeah, I can see why I would want a solar panel or whatever the barriers are. But the one about education was really fascinating to me, where you said the people didn't have enough knowledge about. Did that come is the context, I don't know how to take care of a tree, I don't know how to grow, I don't have a green thumb, or is it, I don't even understand why this is a benefit to me? Why are you pushing this on me? Did it come in both flavors? What was that like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say overall, pretty much most of the people that we talked to said that they would love to have more trees in their neighborhood. So there was really no pushback on the idea of why should we plant more trees, but the lack of knowledge had to do with, well, I don't know how to request a tree, or I don't know if I'm allowed to plant a tree, or I don't know how to care for a tree, and I'm very busy. I mean, I did have one person say, I'd love to have more trees, but I'm really busy and I don't want the responsibility of having to learn how to care for a tree. So it was more on the almost like labor side of it, like doing the work side of it, feeling like they weren't knowledgeable about it.
Mhm. Mhm. Sorry, I have a follow-up and then I'll open up. But this idea that I want a tree, did you get a sense? Is this like a desire to be more sustainable, or is it just because they like the having a tree? I mean, what was the pull to people wanting to put more trees into their spaces?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in some cases, people simply appreciated having a green neighborhood. So when
Mhm.
we did research in neighborhoods that were well canopied, people are really proud of their canopy cover. So this is one of the reasons why I like living here. For people with low canopy cover, because we were doing this work in the summer, they're like, yeah, it'd be great to have more trees. It's really hot here.
Mhm.
And trees were often tied in with green spaces. So this argument, we should have more green space, more trees, all of it would be good.
Mhm. Yeah, Daisy.
So one of the realizations we're having with our own project is that just that idea that people don't want to actually talk. They don't want to open the door sometimes. They don't want to be approached at certain times. And so it's kind of the same battle you have when you actually collect the data. So you collect the data, interview data, survey data. How did you even approach people, residents, to get to talk to you and give you the time of day to actually do that? I mean, I feel like if we can get them to do that, we can also maybe convince them to take one of these free trees.
Right. So for the intercept interviews or intercept surveys, I use that word interchangeably in this case, we stood in public spaces and flagged people down. Um, so on the one hand, it worked well because they tended to be in green spaces with trees. So it was easy to like point at the trees. And I was shocked. A lot of people really wanted to talk about trees. I was delighted. We continued this work as the weather got cooler. And so then we sat in libraries and greeted people as they walked in. And that worked well. And then in one of the communities, which was a suburban community without a lot of street traffic, there was an environmental festival. And so we tabled and talked to people as they came by. Um, so that probably introduced a little bit of bias because it was an environmental festival. So people are already interested in the environment, but they were good ways of approaching people and hearing from all different types of perspectives.
Mhm.
And did you see an age difference or like a just any differences in your sample of people who would be more willing or less willing?
Oh, that's a good question. I personally felt that people were willing to talk and interested. We did introduce an incentive for the intercept interviews, and we had an incentive for the focus groups. So that might have helped. But I think I was pleased with the response rate. I didn't feel like I was having a really hard time approaching one particular demographic. I found, especially the timing of this, we were doing this work maybe in 2022. And I feel like at the timing during the pandemic, it was when people were coming back outside, they were enjoying public space, and they were really happy to talk about their neighborhood and their experience and what they wanted to see.
Mhm. Mhm. Does anybody have a question? I mean, I have another one, but I'm biting my tongue waiting. Okay, maybe I'll ask it and maybe that'll spur conversation. Hamil, a lot of our projects, there was a matching requirement for the project unless you worked in disadvantaged communities, with the sense that, of course, there's shade equity issues across these communities. I noticed in your data when you showed the city versus the suburban versus urban landscape, the tree canopy cover seemed to follow the poverty rate in the city space, but in the suburban space, it didn't. It looked like there's a lot of canopy cover in a high poverty area. I'm wondering if you got a sense of how people in suburban areas versus city areas who live in, let's call them disadvantaged or high poverty areas, did they have a different perspective on this?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So I agree. In the city of Philadelphia, we tend to find that income and canopy cover are correlated. So
Mm,
places with greater wealth tend to have higher canopy cover, but not exclusively.
mhm,
So there are neighborhoods that have been disinvested over time with a lot of vacant land, so they tend to be rather green. So I think, some of the concerns around trees are a little bit different. It might have to do with quality and maintenance.
mhm,
Because people tend to find like overgrown vacant lots with lots of volunteer trees to not necessarily be that desirable.
mhm,
In terms of Sorry, I think I kind of lost the thread of your question there, but I think in the suburbs, one thing to note here is that a lot of the suburbs, they're built around townships that have been there for quite some time. So sometimes the built environment wasn't so distinct from the city of Philadelphia. So they had
mhm,
a lot of row homes, limited yards. The
mhm.
actual geography of them mirrored that of the city of Philadelphia.
Right, so the context matters. Yeah, there's a question from Henrik in the chat. Would you recommend holding city hall meetings where residents can involve in the conversations about planting trees with the local authority?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think for the most part, I'm most familiar with the city of Philadelphia because this is where I've been working, that the city's been doing a lot to reach out to residents to better understand what they want of their canopy cover and how they would like to be involved. And there's a greater emphasis on maintenance. Prior to us doing our study, the city of Philadelphia reached out to, I think, like 2,000 people via a survey to ask them questions about planting trees. So it certainly looks a little bit different from a town hall, but I think this push to get a better sense of what are people's concerns around trees, what would they be open to, what would they like to see, is really important because at the end of the day, residents are the primary stewards, and it's important to understand what they think, what barriers they face.
Mhm. I mean, a follow-up to that would be, I mean, I'm just almost imagining a pre-screening of people who are even open to the idea of planting, because if you're just knocking on doors or doing, and people have this concept or lack of knowledge, they're going to say no, and it's a huge barrier. But the sort of pre-screening people about their attitudes around these things might help you target the population that's most likely to adopt. They'll still probably have barriers, but at least they're open to the conversation. Would you think that would be a good strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's maybe multiple conversations, and I think it's also demonstrating that there's going to be care around trees, that they won't be planted and become a nuisance and be neglected, because a lot of neighborhoods have had that experience in the past, and so they're very distrustful.
Mhm.
I know there's a example of a neighborhood in Philadelphia where I think a high school or young adults were hired to provide tree maintenance. And so we were really curious to see if that would make people more open to planting trees if they see this ongoing care and see that it's people from their neighborhood who are being paid to do this work. So I think there's a need for new models of community engagement around trees. I think it's an important area to invest in right now.
Yeah, there's another question in the chat from Shelley. How realistic is it to expect cities to water and prune for residents once they plant the trees?
Here, it's not realistic at all. There's no expectation that the city will do that work. And I think that's why it's important to recognize that residents are stewards. We think of the tree canopy as being, well, increasingly it's talked about as essential infrastructure in cities. But unlike with streets, residents are the people who are making a lot of the decisions and taking on the responsibility to maintain these trees.
Mhm, mhm,
I think the frustration, sorry to go on about this just a little bit longer, the frustration that that community leaders face is they felt like the city had infrastructure for making tree care easier. And because they weren't using it, volunteers were doing this really hard manual labor that could have been greatly facilitated by, say, a backhoe or a watering truck. And this sense of frustration that why, like, we're doing this, like this is our sweat, and we're doing all of this work because the city can't right now, even though they have the machinery and all this equipment that would make it easier to do this and ensure that newly planted trees aren't dying within the first 3 years.
mhm, mhm. And you said something about volunteers that was interesting. Some of us do work with volunteers, and it sounded like having sort of a planting day and calling a bunch of people to come help you plant was much more effective than keeping a, group of volunteers on an ongoing basis. So it's almost like a feel-good day. Come out and help, protect the environment rather than have a long-term engagement. Is that what you saw in your data as well?
It was, and actually I want to acknowledge the work of Elizabeth Reedman, who was a PhD student, and now she has a postdoc at UCLA, but the focus of her dissertation was around community-based labor and urban greening. And so I think what we found in I'll speak about my work. What we found in this project was that a lot of people had really fond memories of planting a tree as a child. Like it was this moment for them. I helped my grandmother plant a tree in front of her library, or I remember when my class planted a tree in the schoolyard. And I think it's one of those like wonderful moments that people remember. But as far as volunteers go, there's so much more work that needs to be done. And so a number of volunteers discussed how they felt that they were being asked to do so much work, but it was on top of their regular job, but it was the same type of work. So I have to write grants. I need to do all of this work above and beyond just planting the tree and maintaining the network of volunteers and training and knocking on doors and keeping track of who said yes and who said no. And that people just felt that they were being asked a lot and that they were stretched too thin. But when it came to actually planting, people loved to participate in that. Nobody ever said they didn't have enough people. One other thing that's interesting about that is that in the city of Philadelphia, there was a very strong network of community organizations who would help each other, whereas in the suburbs, they didn't seem to have that same network. So they felt a little bit more on their own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, I could talk about this all day. It's super fascinating, but does anybody else have a question they'd like to ask? There is a question from Greg, I believe. Has there been any successful incentive programs or strategies that resulted in residents taking better care of their newly planted trees?
Oh, that's a great question. I think incentive, I'm not sure about. I don't know any examples of where people have been paid to care for trees, but there has been a lot of effort from local greening organizations to provide more support. So there's a tree tenders program to help plant trees. There's what is it called? It's like a pruning program to support pruning across the neighborhood. The city of Philadelphia is in the process of implementing its new tree plan, and they also have IRA funding to do this work, and they're beginning to think about ways of paying people for maintenance. So I think there's a big push, but I haven't heard of incentives. It's really interesting.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, obviously you were studying the barriers that people were facing, but there's also advantages, right? The shade equity is there's an air pollution advantage, a health benefit, of course, electrical bill benefit. Have you ever done, is that I imagine that wasn't part of this study, but have you looked at once you give people the knowledge about the benefits of a shade tree and how that affects their perceptions or attitudes towards this?
Yeah, actually, I think that's where our project kind of picked up, because I think a lot of tree planting initiatives assume that if they tell people about the benefits, they'll plant a tree. So
Mhm.
I think our research looked at all the reasons why people can't plant a tree, even if they want one. Because I feel like for the most part, people we talked about were familiar with the benefits of trees. They were aware that trees provided shade, that they reduced air pollution, that they helped reduce stormwater runoff. And those are really the two big environmental issues that we have here. But just knowing that didn't negate the fact that it might like push up their sidewalk and cause tens of thousands of dollars in repair cost, or that they simply weren't allowed to plant a tree because they were a renter. So I think needing to understand the very like real barriers that people face to doing things that they might want to do is important, because I think there's been this message for low canopy neighborhoods that you really should plant trees. It'll be really good for you, without recognizing that there are other reasons why people aren't doing that.
Hmm. And this idea of pushing up sidewalks keeps coming up, and I can totally get it because when I planted a tree, I was worried about my foundation, which is, coming from my parents, they were worried about their foundation. Where are residents getting their information about which tree is appropriate to plant in terms of, safety and not messing their sidewalks up?
Sure. So there's a lot of work around this idea of right tree, right place.
Mhm.
And so I think there is a lot of support for understanding like what stature tree is appropriate under a power line and what type of tree will be appropriate for what place. And this tree planting organization that I've been mentioning, they try to provide a lot of support for people planting trees. But I think all of that comes in after they've said yes.
Aha.
And yeah, I think those concerns, like somebody saw somebody down the street once when they were a kid have this issue, and that memory persists.
Mhm.
And it's hard to forget it, or it's hard to see that that might not happen, or that there are ways of preventing it. I think the narratives around trees as damaging is really powerful because homeowners and residents are really concerned.
Mhm. Mhm. Question from Daisy. What can be done to facilitate tree planting at properties that are rented?
Oh, right. Yeah, that was the main question that came up for city leaders. I I think it's a challenge. Being able to get access to property owners is really important to get permission to plant the trees, but it actually goes beyond that a little bit. We talked to some renters who had planted trees and then they moved on, and somebody, the next tenant didn't care for it and it didn't survive. So having a different system of caring for trees. I actually asked my students at Temple that same question because we have an environmental studies major. We have a lot of students who are really passionate about these issues. And they felt that they really couldn't plant a tree in front of where they live because they were renting. So I think having different systems for maintaining trees and rental spaces is important. They don't necessarily have a great simple solution for addressing it.
Yeah. Let me pause and see if there are any other questions from anybody. I don't see hands or anything in the chat. Just out of curiosity, did these leaders, community leaders who were planting trees, come from the communities that they were planting in? Were they aware of what they were doing, where they were doing it?
Oh yeah. The program's designed to initially identify a person who would like to become a community leader in their neighborhood. And then this organization, the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, works with them to kind of build out their tree planting program.
Okay.
So they're all residents of the neighborhoods where they're working.
Okay.
Which doesn't mean to say there aren't tensions within. You can still have tensions within neighborhoods, but they do start with people who live there.
Yeah, it's like higher education. When you go to administration, you go to the dark side. You're part of the city, not part of the community anymore. So I can see that.
Oh, well, it's separate. It's completely separate from the city. It's yeah, it's just it really is a community initiative. And they're volunteers.
Uh, and
They're
there's
not.
still pushback. Wow.
Yeah, I think, well, neighborhoods are still large and there's still a lot of different opinions.
Yeah.
And a lot of neighborhoods experience a lot of change. People move in, they move out.
Mhm.
Trees take a long time to grow, so.
So was there a sense that this was being imposed on residents? Sorry, I'm just so super curious about this. Did they feel like I'm being told what to do with my property, like someone's forcing this down my throat at all?
I think for the most part, people did not feel that way, but I
Okay.
think for maybe some like institutions, they felt that they were really being like, people are really encouraging them to plant trees and they didn't want to do it largely because of maintenance costs. But I
Mhm.
think for the average resident, no, the average resident that we talked to like didn't know about the tree planting opportunities that they had. It was really more of I love this idea. How do I get involved? Or, I love this idea, but I wish somebody else would do it because I don't have capacity.
Right, right. There's a comment from Brian. I don't see a question, but I think it's a good comment to talk about. I would be interested in examples of successful community group and municipal partnerships for successful tree planting and post-planting success, as well as barriers that had to be overcome. We are also repairing sidewalks around existing trees as part of our IRA grant project, in addition to tree planting on the same street blocks. Right tree for right spot is great, but municipalities need to invest more for sidewalks around trees.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I'm feeling kind of like guilty. I feel like my presentation like painted it all as like a series of people saying no to trees. Um, No, but I think for the most part, there has been a lot of success with planting trees in the city of Philadelphia. There was recently a study that was done that looked at changes in canopy cover over a 10-year period. I think it was 2008 to 2018. And the number one reason that trees were lost was due to development. So, we have this tension between like, there's a dire need for more housing in this city. And through that, construction process, trees are lost. It's not because everybody's ripping out their trees and refusing to plant them. So there's a lot of success stories of canopy cover gains in certain areas through intentional planting. And there's a lot of really, when we talk to people, there's a lot of pride about how green the city of Philadelphia is, and a lot of interest in planting trees. I think the point about sidewalks is a great one. In Philadelphia, property owners have to pay for the sidewalks. So it would be wonderful to have more support for cities to repair and maintain these sidewalks, because it is very costly and it's a concern for people that trees will ruin their sidewalks and require them to repair them.
So there's another from Marco. During school yard greening applications, I spoke to school representatives, and there's a lot of pushback from maintenance workers, limited crew personnel, limited resources, and lack of perhaps knowledge of the benefits of trees.
Yeah, that's a great comment. We really saw that. And we heard that working with the school district is like working with a whole different government, that they have their own set of preferences and concerns. One of the school districts that we heard about, they didn't want to plant any more trees because they didn't want any pushback if they needed to like expand a building or add a new playground. They didn't want to have, they thought removing a tree would be very hard. So they just didn't want to plant one in the first place. And I know for a lot of schools in the city of Philadelphia, adding any more maintenance, it just adds more work to one person. They're already very limited in what they can do. So I think it's truly something that needs to be addressed, because children benefit from green schoolyards so much.
Yeah, for sure. We're wrapping up here, folks. So is there anyone else who has a last minute question they'd like to ask? Either raise your hand. Okay, I don't see any. So thank you so much for, first of all, for Dr. Pearsall for the presentation. It was incredibly informative. And then, of course, thank you for everybody who showed up. We have recorded this. Are we going to post this online on our website? Are you okay with that, Hamil, to post this presentation?
Sure.
Fantastic. So we will have this recording online if in case your colleagues want to follow up. We do have the study as well. So if you're interested in that, we can pass that along to you. And other than that, I want to thank everybody for your attendance and your attention. And we hope we'll invite you back when you have more data on how to do this, Hamil. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. Have a great afternoon, everyone.